When my boyfriend Mark looked me in the eyes and said, "You're just a simple nurse, Lisa. If you were a doctor, maybe I'd respect you," I just smiled. Because in that moment, there was a tiny detail poor Mark didn't know. That simple nurse he was looking down on had exactly $22 million sitting in her bank account. When he found out the truth, he didn't just faint. He lived the biggest regret of his life. But that fainting spell was just the beginning of the end for him. I taught him a lesson so harsh, you won't even guess how this story ends. You do not want to miss this revenge, so watch until the very end. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe and comment justice below. Now buckle up. My name is Lisa Morgan. I am a nurse in Newark working long shifts and touching lives. From the outside, I look like just another ordinary, tired person trying to pay the bills. And honestly, I prefer it that way, because I have a secret that no one, absolutely no one, knows about. An empire I built through years of smart investments, stock market moves, and a vow to never depend on anyone again. Exactly $22 million. I don't spend it. I don't show it off. It is my safety shield, a secret written in a legacy file that I instructed to be opened only when I die. But then, Mark entered my life. Mark Reynolds, 35 years old, handsome, charismatic, but with an ego bigger than his height. Mark is in love with status. He worships labels, brands, and titles. In our first few months, he described me as an angel doing holy work. But as our relationship got serious, the mask started to slip. "Do you have a shift again?" Mark asked, tipping the waiter without even looking at me. "Yes, Mark, my patients need me," I said calmly. He laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was condescending and cold. "Sometimes I wonder, Lisa, why didn't you aim higher? I mean, look at my friends' wives, lawyers, doctors, CEOs. You just give shots to patients. I imagined a more powerful woman by my side." In that moment, I felt something break in my heart, but it wasn't my love that broke. It was my respect for him. I squeezed the water glass in my hand. In my bag under the table, on my tablet, my bank account was open. With one button, I could buy this restaurant and kick him out. With one sentence, I could buy that car he brags about as if it were spare change. But I didn't. "Status isn't everything, Mark," I said quietly. "Character is what matters." Mark rolled his eyes. "Character doesn't pay the bills, darling. Anyway, my friends are coming tonight. Please don't tell those shift stories again. I'll try to make you look a bit more cool." That was the moment I decided. Mark deserved a lesson, but I wasn't going to tell him the truth. He was going to be a victim of his own arrogance, and fate was about to give me that opportunity much sooner than I thought. One day, I left my computer open at home. On the screen was that famous legacy file, left open by mistake. When Mark walked in, he had no idea our lives were about to change forever. Mark stood frozen in the doorway of my home office, staring at the computer screen like he'd seen a ghost. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the sound of papers rustling, then a sharp gasp, then nothing. Complete silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle with awareness that something massive has just shifted in the universe. I walked slowly toward the office, my heart pounding not with fear but with a strange sense of anticipation. This wasn't how I'd planned to reveal anything, but life has a funny way of writing its own script. When I reached the doorway, I saw Mark sitting in my desk chair, his face drained of all color, holding the printed summary page from my investment portfolio. His hands were trembling so badly the paper was shaking like a leaf in a storm. $22 million, he whispered, his voice barely audible. $22 million. His eyes darted from the paper to the screen, then back to the paper, as if he couldn't process what he was reading. Then his eyes rolled back, his body went limp, and he collapsed right there in my office chair, sliding onto the floor in a heap. For a moment, I just stood there, watching this man who had spent months belittling me, lying unconscious on my hardwood floor because the truth had literally knocked him out. I didn't rush to help him immediately. Instead, I took a slow sip of my tea and thought about all the times he'd made me feel small, all the dinners where he'd introduced me as just a nurse, all the moments he'd suggested I wasn't quite good enough for his world. Now here he was, flat on his back, undone by the very person he'd underestimated. I set my tea down and checked his pulse, my nursing instincts kicking in despite everything. He was fine, just shocked into unconsciousness. I got a cold cloth and placed it on his forehead, then sat down and waited for him to come back to reality. When Mark's eyes finally fluttered open about 5 minutes later, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before on his face. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, greed, and something that looked almost like fear. He sat up slowly, rubbing his head, and then suddenly grabbed my hand with both of his. "Lisa, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me? We're partners. We should share everything." The change in his tone was so dramatic, it would have been comical if it wasn't so pathetic. This was the same man who yesterday had suggested I should consider a more impressive career if I wanted to keep up with his social circle. "Share everything?" I asked calmly, pulling my hand away from his grip. "Like how you shared your real feelings about my career? Or how you shared with your friends at that dinner party last week that dating me was a charity project?" "Yes, Mark, I heard that." His face flushed red, and he opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. "Don't. I'm not interested in your excuses right now. You need to leave." Mark scrambled to his feet, suddenly looking panicked, like a man who just realized he'd thrown away a winning lottery ticket. "Wait, Lisa, please, let me explain. I was just trying to fit in with those guys, you know how they are. I never meant any of it. I love you. I want to marry you." Marry me. The words that should have filled me with joy instead made my stomach turn, because I knew with absolute certainty that Mark wasn't seeing me right now. He was seeing $22 million. He was seeing penthouses, luxury cars, exotic vacations, and a lifestyle he'd always dreamed of but never quite achieved on his own. The man who had spent our entire relationship making me feel inadequate was now desperate to keep me, because suddenly I represented everything he'd ever wanted. "Get out, Mark," I said quietly but firmly. "We're done." He didn't move, just stood there with his mouth hanging open, looking like I'd slapped him across the face. "You don't mean that. You're upset, I understand. But we can work through this. Think about everything we've built together." Everything we'd built? I almost laughed. What had we built except a relationship where he felt superior and I felt tolerated? "I need time to think," he finally said, his voice taking on a manipulative edge. "Don't make any rash decisions. I'll call you tomorrow and we'll talk about our future properly." Our future. He said it like it was already decided, like my money had bought him a permanent place in my life. I watched him gather his things, noticed how his eyes kept darting back to the computer screen, probably trying to memorize the numbers he'd seen. As he walked toward the door, he turned back one more time. "I always knew you were special, Lisa. I just didn't realize how special." And with that pathetic attempt at recovery, he left. The moment the door closed, I sat down on my couch and let out a long breath. My secret was out, at least to Mark, and I knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. Because men like Mark don't just walk away from $22 million. They scheme, they manipulate, they try to find angles and leverage. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Jonathan Wright, a brilliant attorney I'd kept on retainer for years, precisely for situations like this. "Jonathan, we need to talk. Tonight, if possible. Something's happened." Jonathan arrived at my apartment within 2 hours, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the concerned expression of a man who knew that when I called for an emergency meeting, it was serious. I'd been working with Jonathan for almost 8 years, ever since my investments started generating real wealth, and he was one of only 3 people in the world who knew the full extent of my financial situation. The other 2 were my accountant, Margaret, and my financial advisor, David Chen, both of whom had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements years ago. "Talk to me, Lisa," Jonathan said, settling into my armchair and pulling out a legal pad. I told him everything about Mark, about the months of subtle and not-so-subtle put-downs, about how he'd found the legacy file, about his fainting spell, and subsequent desperate attempts to suddenly claim we were meant to be together. As I talked, Jonathan's expression grew darker and darker. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, tapping his pen against the legal pad in that way he did when he was thinking through legal strategies. "First things first," Jonathan finally said. "We need to document everything, every text message, every voicemail, every interaction you have with this man from now on. I want timestamps, I want witnesses when possible, and I want you to never, under any circumstances, be alone with him in a private space." The seriousness in his tone made my stomach clench. "You think he's dangerous?" Jonathan shook his head. "I think he's desperate. And desperate people do unpredictable things. Men like Mark, who base their entire self-worth on status and money, can become very creative when they think they're about to lose access to both." We spent the next 3 hours going through my options. Jonathan suggested a restraining order if Mark became threatening, documented our strategy for protecting my assets if he tried to claim some kind of common-law marriage arrangement, which was legally impossible in New Jersey, but might not stop him from trying. And most importantly, we updated my legacy file to explicitly exclude Mark Reynolds from any knowledge of or access to my estate under any circumstances. "I'm also going to recommend something else," Jonathan said as he was packing up his briefcase. "Hire a private investigator to look into Mark's background. Men who are this focused on status and money often have financial problems they're hiding. Knowledge is power, Lisa, and right now you need all the power you can get." The next morning, I woke up to 47 text messages from Mark. They started apologetic around 2 in the morning, progressed to angry by 4, swung back to pleading by 6, and by 8 had settled into a disturbing pattern of talking about our future together and the life we're going to build as if the previous day's breakup had never happened. I forwarded all of them to Jonathan and then blocked Mark's number. But blocking his phone number didn't stop him from showing up at the hospital where I worked. I was in the middle of checking vitals on a post-op patient when Jennifer, one of the younger nurses, poked her head into the room with a weird expression on her face. "Lisa, there's a guy in the lobby asking for you. Says he's your fiancé?" My patient, Mrs. Rodriguez, a sweet 72-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery, looked up with interest. "You're engaged? Oh, honey, congratulations." I felt my jaw clench. "I'm not engaged. Excuse me for just a moment, Mrs. Rodriguez." I walked to the lobby with my heart pounding, and sure enough, there was Mark, holding an enormous bouquet of roses and wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Surprise!" Mark said loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the waiting area. "I wanted to bring flowers to my beautiful bride-to-be at work." He moved toward me with his arms open for a hug, but I stepped back, maintaining a professional distance. "Mark, we need to talk privately, not here." His smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place. "Of course, darling. Wherever you want." I led him to a small consultation room off the main hallway, closed the door, and turned to face him with my arms crossed. "We broke up yesterday," I said firmly. "I'm not your bride-to-be, I'm not your girlfriend, and you need to stop telling people we're engaged." Mark set the roses down on the chair and moved closer to me, his expression shifting from performative happiness to something more intense. "Lisa, come on. You were upset yesterday, I get it, but you can't throw away what we have because of a few stupid comments I made. I love you, and I know you love me too." The audacity of this man was truly breathtaking. Mark, the only thing that changed yesterday was that you found out about my money. Before that, you spent months making me feel like I wasn't good enough for you. Now suddenly you love me? I'm not stupid. His face hardened, and for the first time I saw something almost ugly flash across his features. Is that what you think? That I only care about your money? That's insulting, Lisa. I've been with you for almost a year, supporting you, encouraging you. Supporting me? Encouraging me? I almost laughed out loud. Supporting me by telling me nursing wasn't a real profession. Encouraging me by asking why I couldn't be more like your friends' wives. Mark, I heard every word you said, and I felt every dismissive look. The only thing your reaction yesterday proved was that I was right about you all along. Mark was quiet for a moment, and I could see him recalculating his approach in real time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable. The tone he'd used in the early days of our relationship when he was still trying to win me over. You're right. I was an asshole. I was insecure because my business hasn't been doing as well as I wanted, and I took it out on you. But I can change, Lisa. Give me a chance to prove it. Let me show you that I can be the man you deserve. Now we were getting somewhere. His business wasn't doing well. That explained some of the status obsession, the constant name-dropping, the expensive suit he probably couldn't afford. I appreciate the apology, Mark, but the answer is still no. We're not compatible. And finding out about my financial situation doesn't change the fundamental problems in our relationship. I need you to respect my decision and give me space. I moved toward the door, ready to end this conversation and get back to my patients, but Mark grabbed my arm. Not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to stop me. Don't do this, Lisa. You're making a huge mistake. Do you know how many women would kill to be in your position? I'm offering you everything. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face, and spoke with the kind of cold clarity that comes from absolute certainty. Take your hand off me right now, or I will call security and have you escorted out of this hospital with a formal trespass warning. Your choice. Mark's hand dropped like I'd burned him, and something shifted in his expression. The mask cracked completely, and what I saw underneath was equal parts rage and desperation. You're going to regret this, he said quietly. You think you're so smart with your secret millions, but you're just a stupid nurse who got lucky. You need me more than I need you. Security did end up escorting Mark out of the hospital that day, but not before he caused enough of a scene in the lobby that the entire staff was buzzing about it for the rest of the week. He'd shouted something about me being ungrateful and throwing away the best thing that ever happened to me, which would have been mortifying, except that most of my colleagues knew me well enough to recognize crazy when they saw it. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Chen, called me into her office afterward to make sure I was okay and to document the incident in case we needed to pursue a formal restraining order. That man has narcissist written all over him, Patricia said, sliding a cup of coffee across her desk toward me. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before becoming a hospital administrator, and she had a razor-sharp ability to read people. I've seen this pattern before. Men who feel entitled to women they view as beneath them, then can't handle rejection. You need to be careful, Lisa. Document everything and don't underestimate what he might do. Her words echoed Jonathan's warning from the night before, and a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Was Mark actually dangerous, or just pathetic and desperate? I got my answer sooner than expected. That night, when I got home from my shift, I found my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart immediately started racing. I knew for certain I'd locked it that morning because I always double-checked after the incident with my elderly neighbor last year who'd had an intruder. I pulled out my phone, stepped back from the door, and called 911. The police arrived within 10 minutes, cleared my apartment, and confirmed what I'd already suspected. Someone had broken in. Nothing major was taken, but my desk drawers had been rifled through, papers were scattered across my office floor, and most tellingly, my computer had been moved. The responding officer, a tired-looking man in his 40s, named Officer Davidson, took notes while his partner dusted for fingerprints. "Do you know anyone who might have wanted to break in? Any enemies, ex-boyfriends, work conflicts?" I hesitated for just a moment before telling him about Mark, about the breakup, about the scene at the hospital that morning. Officer Davidson's expression shifted from routine investigation mode to something more concerned. "Ma'am, I'm going to be straight with you. This has all the hallmarks of an obsessed ex-partner situation. The fact that nothing valuable was taken but your personal papers were searched suggests someone was looking for information, not money." I filed a formal police report that night and called Jonathan immediately afterward. He arranged for a locksmith to come out at midnight to change all my locks, installed a security camera system the next day, and fast-tracked the restraining order application. But the break-in had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. For years, I'd lived in relative anonymity. My wealth, a private shield that protected me from the chaos of the world. Now that shield felt like a target on my back. Mark knew I had money, and based on the break-in, he was clearly trying to figure out exactly how much and where it was kept. The private investigator Jonathan hired was a woman named Diana Torres, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial fraud cases. She came to my apartment 3 days after the break-in, carrying a slim laptop case and wearing the kind of neutral clothing that made her instantly forgettable, perfect for her line of work. "Tell me everything about Mark Reynolds," she said, settling into my couch and opening her laptop. So I did. I told her about how we'd met at a charity gala, how charming he'd been initially, how gradually his true colors had shown. I gave her his business name, his address, the names of friends he'd mentioned, everything I could remember. Diana worked fast. Within a week, she had compiled a dossier on Mark that was both illuminating and terrifying. Mark Reynolds, it turned out, was not the successful businessman he pretended to be. His consulting company was barely making ends meet. He had over $200,000 in credit card debt. He'd been sued twice by former business partners for fraud, and most damning of all, he'd done this before. 3 years ago, he dated a woman named Rebecca Thompson, a successful real estate developer, for 8 months. When she'd broken up with him, he'd launched a harassment campaign that included stalking, reputation destruction through social media, and eventually an attempt to sue her for emotional damages that had been thrown out of court. "This man is a professional con artist," Diana said, showing me Rebecca's court documents on her laptop. "He targets successful women, tries to lock them down quickly, and when that doesn't work, he either tries to extort money or destroys their reputation out of spite. You need to be extremely careful, Lisa. Men like Mark don't just give up and walk away." I stared at the documents, feeling sick to my stomach. How would I miss this? How would I let someone like this into my life? Diana must have seen the self-recrimination on my face because she reached across and touched my arm gently. "Don't blame yourself. These guys are good at what they do. They're charming, they know exactly what to say, and they're experts at hiding their true nature until it's too late." Armed with Diana's research, Jonathan filed for an emergency restraining order, and we included all the evidence of Mark's previous harassment campaign against Rebecca. The judge granted it immediately, and Mark was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me, my workplace or my home. I thought that might be the end of it, that the legal system would protect me and Mark would finally back off. I was wrong. 2 days after the restraining order was served, I started receiving anonymous emails. They came from disposable email addresses that changed with each message, but the content made it clear they were from Mark. The first email was almost polite. "You can't hide behind lawyers forever, Lisa. We're meant to be together, and you know it. Stop being stubborn and just talk to me." The second was less friendly. "Do you really think a piece of paper is going to keep me away from what's mine? You owe me for all the time I invested in this relationship." By the 5th email, the tone had shifted to outright threatening. "You're going to regret embarrassing me. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are, cold, selfish, and ungrateful." I forwarded every single email to Jonathan and Officer Davidson, building a case for violation of the restraining order. But Mark was too smart to do anything overtly illegal. The emails, while disturbing, were carefully worded to avoid direct threats. He never said, "I'm going to hurt you," or "I'm going to show up at your house." Instead, it was all vague intimidation and emotional manipulation. Meanwhile, I started noticing other strange things. My car had a flat tire 3 days in a row, each time with a small puncture that could have been accidental or deliberate. Someone left a dead bouquet of roses on my doorstep with a card that said, "What we had is dead because of you." My professional social media profiles suddenly got flooded with 1-star reviews from fake accounts claiming I was a terrible nurse who didn't care about her patients. The smear campaign Mark launched against me was systematic and vicious. He created fake patient accounts on hospital review sites, posted made-up stories about medical negligence on nursing forums, and even tried to file a formal complaint with the New Jersey Board of Nursing, claiming I'd provided substandard care to him during a hospital visit that never happened. Each attack was designed to damage my professional reputation. The one thing Mark knew I valued even more than my hidden wealth. What he didn't count on was how thoroughly Diana Torres could dismantle his schemes. Diana traced every fake account back to IP addresses that pinged to locations Mark frequented, compiled timestamps that showed the accounts were created within hours of each other from the same devices, and built an airtight case proving he was behind the entire harassment campaign. When we presented this evidence to the police, they finally had enough to charge Mark with cyber-stalking, harassment, and violation of the restraining order. The day the police arrested him at his apartment, Diana called me with an edge of satisfaction in her voice. He tried to delete everything when they showed up with the warrant, but digital footprints don't disappear that easily. They've got him cold. I should have felt relieved, maybe even victorious, but instead I just felt tired. Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of checking my locks 3 times before bed, tired of this man who I dated for less than a year consuming so much of my mental and emotional energy. Mark made bail within 24 hours, of course, probably borrowing money from whatever friends he hadn't already burned bridges with, and his lawyer immediately went on the offensive. They claimed Mark was the real victim here, that I'd led him on, that I'd intentionally hidden my wealth to manipulate him, and that his reaction was just that of a heartbroken man who'd been deceived. The legal battle that followed was exhausting. Mark's lawyer tried every angle they could think of to paint me as the villain. They subpoenaed my financial records, trying to prove I'd somehow defrauded Mark by not disclosing my net worth earlier in the relationship, which was laughable but had to be defended against. They interviewed my colleagues at the hospital, looking for anyone who might say something negative about me. They even tracked down my ex-husband from 10 years ago, hoping he'd provide some damaging testimony about my character. But here's the thing about living an honest, ethical life. Even when you have money to hide, the people who actually know you will defend you. My colleagues at the hospital rallied around me in a way that brought tears to my eyes. Dr. Patricia Chen wrote a detailed letter to the court describing my professionalism, my dedication to patients, and my character. Every nurse on my floor signed a petition supporting me. Patients I'd cared for over the years, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd witnessed Mark's first dramatic appearance in the hospital lobby, voluntarily came forward to provide statements about the quality of care I'd given them. Even my ex-husband, Tom, who I'd divorced amicably a decade ago, sent a message through the lawyers saying that while our marriage hadn't worked out, he'd never questioned my integrity or honesty. Mark's case fell apart piece by piece. The judge threw out the lawsuit claiming I'd emotionally manipulated him by hiding my wealth, ruling that there was no legal obligation to disclose personal financial information in a non-marital relationship, and that Mark's claims bordered on frivolous. The criminal charges for cyberstalking and harassment stuck, and Mark was facing potential jail time. But what really destroyed him wasn't the legal system. It was his own arrogance and the fact that he'd severely underestimated who he was dealing with. Remember how Diana had uncovered Mark's previous harassment campaign against Rebecca Thompson? Well, Rebecca had been following my case through mutual legal contacts, and she reached out to me directly. We met at a quiet coffee shop in downtown Newark, two women who'd had the misfortune of dating the same con artist, and something clicked immediately. Rebecca was brilliant, sharp as a knife, and absolutely done with men like Mark getting away with their behavior. I settled with him last time because my lawyers said it would be easier than a prolonged legal battle, Rebecca told me, stirring her latte with barely contained anger. I gave him $50,000 just to make him go away. Biggest regret of my life because I know he just used that money to fund his lifestyle while he looked for the next target, which turned out to be you. He's not getting a penny from me, I said firmly. Rebecca smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for an opportunity for revenge. Good. And I have an idea about how we can make sure he never does this to anyone else again. Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca laid out a plan that was so elegant, so perfectly designed to use Mark's own weaknesses against him, that I couldn't help but admire it. Rebecca still had contacts in the business community from her real estate days, and she'd heard through the grapevine that Mark had been trying to secure investors for a new business venture, some kind of luxury consulting service for high-net-worth individuals. The irony was almost too perfect. He's been telling potential investors that he has connections to wealthy clients, that he's about to close a major deal, basically selling them smoke and mirrors, Rebecca explained. But what if we made sure the right people knew exactly who Mark Reynolds really is? Not through gossip or rumors, but through documented legal facts. His fraud lawsuits, his harassment charges, his restraining orders, all public record just compiled in a very convenient, easy-to-share format. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't even unethical. It was simply making sure that the truth about Mark was as easily accessible as the lies he'd been spreading about himself. Diana helped us create what she called a truth dossier, a comprehensive document that laid out Mark's legal history, his pattern of targeting successful women, his financial troubles, and his current criminal charges. Everything in it was verified, sourced from public court records, and completely factual. Then Rebecca used her business contacts to make sure this dossier found its way to every investor Mark had approached, every professional organization he was part of, and every social circle he'd tried to infiltrate. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within 2 weeks, Mark's already shaky business completely collapsed. The investors pulled out, his few remaining clients fired him, and his reputation in the business community was thoroughly destroyed. His lawyer called Jonathan, practically begging for a settlement, offering to drop all remaining legal actions if we'd just stop the public persecution. Jonathan's response was cold and perfect. "My client has done nothing but tell the truth. If Mr. Reynolds finds the truth persecuting, perhaps he should have lived a different life." The criminal case went to trial 3 months later, and I had to testify about the harassment, the break-in, the emails, all of it. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at Mark across the room while his lawyer tried desperately to paint him as a misunderstood victim of a cruel woman, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger anymore, not even satisfaction at watching his world crumble. Just a profound sense of clarity about who I was and what really mattered. Mark had spent our entire relationship trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that being just a nurse meant I was somehow less valuable than people with fancier titles or bigger bank accounts. But sitting there in my simple work clothes, having just come from a 12-hour shift where I'd helped save 2 lives and comforted a dying patient's family, I'd never felt more proud of who I was. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. Diana Torres testified as an expert witness, walking the jury through the pattern of behavior, the digital evidence, the previous victim's experience. Rebecca Thompson took the stand and told her story, her voice steady and strong as she described the months of harassment she'd endured 3 years ago. Several of my colleagues testified about the scene Mark had caused at the hospital and the fear they'd witnessed in me afterward. The evidence was overwhelming, and Mark's lawyer knew it. By the third day of trial, they were clearly scrambling, trying to negotiate a plea deal. But the moment that sealed Mark's fate came when the prosecutor presented text messages Mark had sent to a friend during our relationship, messages Diana had uncovered through a subpoena of his phone records. In them, Mark had explicitly laid out his plan to lock down the rich nurse. Before she figured out what he was really after, he'd bragged about how easy it would be to manipulate me, how nurses were soft targets who desperately wanted to be valued, and how once we were married, he'd have access to the money he needed to finally live the life he deserved. The jury's expressions when those messages were read aloud told me everything I needed to know. Mark was convicted on all counts: cyberstalking, criminal harassment, violation of a restraining order, and attempted fraud. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen too many cases like this, didn't mince words during sentencing. "Mr. Reynolds, you have shown a complete lack of remorse for your actions and a disturbing pattern of viewing successful women as objects to be exploited rather than people to be respected. Your behavior wasn't that of a heartbroken man, as your defense claims. It was calculated, predatory, and dangerous. I'm sentencing you to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation with mandatory counseling and a permanent order prohibiting you from contacting either Ms. Morgan or Ms. Thompson ever again." As they led Mark away, he turned and looked at me one last time. I expected to see anger or hatred or that manipulative desperation he'd shown so many times before. Instead, I just saw a broken man who'd finally run out of people to con and schemes to run. I felt nothing. Not triumph, not pity, just a profound sense of closure. That chapter of my life was finally, definitively over. Rebecca and I walked out of the courthouse together into the bright afternoon sunshine, and she turned to me with a smile. "You know what the best part of all this is? He spent all that energy trying to get your money, and he ended up with nothing except a prison sentence and a destroyed reputation. That's what I call justice." We went to dinner that night to celebrate, and somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, Rebecca asked the question I'd been expecting. "So what are you going to do now? You've got $22 million, you're free from Mark, and you've got your whole life ahead of you. Are you going to keep being a nurse?" I didn't even have to think about my answer. Absolutely. I love being a nurse. It's who I am, not just what I do. The money is security, it's freedom, it's the ability to help people when I want to. But nursing is my purpose. Rebecca raised her wine glass in a toast to purposes that money can't buy and to men who learned the hard way that you can't put a price on character. The months after the trial were strange in the best possible way. Life slowly returned to normal, or rather, to a new kind of normal where I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder or waiting for the next shoe to drop. I threw myself back into my work at the hospital, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for the mentorship program for new nurses. But something had changed in me during the ordeal with Mark. I'd spent so many years hiding my wealth, treating it like a shameful secret that had to be protected at all costs, and now I started to wonder if maybe there was a better way to live. I had a long conversation with Jonathan one evening about what I actually wanted my legacy to be. Not just the legacy file that would distribute my money after I died, but the impact I wanted to make while I was still alive. "I've been thinking," I told him, "about all the times in my life when I struggled, when I didn't have enough money for rent or medical bills or school. What if I could help people in those situations now? What if instead of just sitting on this money until I die, I actually use some of it to make a difference?" Jonathan smiled, that rare, genuine smile that meant he approved of something I was doing. "I was wondering when you'd get here. Let's talk about setting up a foundation." Over the next 6 months, we established the Morgan Foundation for Healthcare Workers, a charitable organization dedicated to providing financial assistance, education grants, and mental health support for nurses, home health aides, and other frontline healthcare workers who were struggling. I didn't put my name on it publicly at first, preferring to work behind the scenes, but word got out eventually. The first time a young nursing student who'd received a Morgan Foundation grant to pay for her tuition showed up at the hospital and hugged me with tears in her eyes, telling me that I'd saved her from dropping out of school, I understood why I'd been given this wealth in the first place. It wasn't for fancy cars or designer clothes or impressing people like Mark. It was for this, for the ability to change lives in real, concrete ways. The foundation started small, helping a dozen healthcare workers in its first year, but it grew quickly. Rebecca Thompson came on board as a trustee, using her business expertise to help us manage the investments and maximize the impact of every dollar. Dr. Patricia Chen helped us identify the healthcare workers most in need of support. Even Diana Torres volunteered her investigative skills to help us root out fraud and make sure the money was going to legitimate recipients who really needed it. What had started as my private revenge against the world that had tried to make me feel small had transformed into something much bigger and more meaningful. 2 years after Mark's conviction, I was working a night shift when I got called down to the emergency room for a complicated case. A car accident victim had come in with multiple injuries, and they needed all hands on deck. I was so focused on setting up the IV line and monitoring vitals that I didn't even look at the patient's face at first. When I finally did, my hands froze for just a second. It was Mark. He'd been released early from prison for good behavior, apparently, and had been in a drunk driving accident on the highway. He was conscious, in pain, and when he saw me standing there in my scrubs with his life literally in my hands, his expression went through a dozen emotions in the span of seconds: fear, shame, desperation, and then, bizarrely, relief. "Lisa," he whispered through cracked lips, "please, help me." And here's the thing about being a nurse, about taking an oath to care for people regardless of who they are or what they've done. In that moment, Mark wasn't the man who'd harassed me, who'd tried to steal from me, who'd made my life hell for months. He was a patient who needed help. I adjusted his IV, checked his blood, pressure, and spoke to him in the same calm, professional voice I used with every patient. "You're going to be okay. We've got you." I worked on Mark for 3 hours that night, alongside Dr. Patricia Chen and the rest of the emergency team. We stabilized his condition, treated his injuries, and got him admitted for observation. Professional, efficient, compassionate, everything a good nurse should be. When my shift ended and I was walking out to my car in the cold pre-dawn darkness, Patricia caught up with me. "That took a lot of strength," she said quietly. "Taking care of someone who hurt you that badly, most people couldn't do it." I shrugged, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the long shift. He's still a human being, and I'm still a nurse. Those two things don't change just because of history. Mark tried to talk to me the next day when I came in for my shift. He'd been moved to a regular recovery room, and apparently, he'd been asking for me specifically. I debated whether to go see him, whether there was any point to opening that door again, but eventually, curiosity won out. When I walked into his room, Mark was sitting up in bed, looking worse than I'd ever seen him, not just physically injured, but broken in some fundamental way. "Thank you," he said immediately, "for saving my life. You had every reason to walk away and let someone else handle it, but you didn't." "That's not who I am," I replied simply. We sat in silence for a moment, and then Mark started talking. Really talking. Maybe for the first time in his life. He told me about how prison had forced him to confront the person he'd become, about the therapy sessions where he'd had to face the damage he'd done to people, about how, when he got out, he'd discovered that his entire life had been built on sand, and now there was nothing left. I lost everything. Mark said, and there were actual tears in his eyes. My business, my reputation, my friends, all because I was too arrogant to see what actually mattered. You tried to tell me that character was more important than status, and I laughed at you. God, I was such a fool. I could have gloated, could have reminded him of every terrible thing he'd said and done, could have told him that he deserved everything that had happened to him. But looking at this broken man in a hospital bed, I realized that revenge had never been what I actually wanted. What I'd wanted was for him to understand, to really, truly understand why what he'd done was wrong. And somehow, impossibly, it seemed like he finally did. I forgive you, Mark, I said quietly, and watched his eyes widen in shock. Not because you deserve it, or because what you did was okay, but because holding on to anger is exhausting, and I'm done letting you take up space in my head. Mark left the hospital 3 days later, and I never saw him again. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to a different state, gotten a regular job working in customer service at a call center, and was living in a modest apartment and attending therapy twice a week. No more schemes, no more cons. Just a man trying to rebuild his life from scratch with honesty this time. I don't know if his transformation was real or if it would last, but I hoped for his sake that it was. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even people who've done terrible things. Life moved forward in the way that life does. The Morgan Foundation continued to grow, helping hundreds of healthcare workers get through financial crises, pay for their education, and access mental health support. I got promoted to senior nurse manager at the hospital, a position where I could mentor young nurses and help shape policy. Rebecca became one of my closest friends, and we had regular dinners where we traded stories about work, life, and the occasional terrible date that reminded us both why we were perfectly happy being single for a while. On the 5-year anniversary of Mark's conviction, I was cleaning out my home office when I came across the original legacy file that had started this whole nightmare. I opened it, read through the carefully worded legal language about how my estate should be distributed upon my death, and realized that it needed to be completely rewritten. Not because the legal structure was wrong, but because my entire philosophy had changed. I didn't want my wealth to be some secret revealed after I died. I wanted to use it now, while I was alive, to make the world better. I called Jonathan and told him we needed to revise everything. The new legacy file would still protect my assets and ensure they were distributed properly, but the bulk of my estate would go to the foundation, with specific instructions for how it should be used to expand the mission of supporting healthcare workers. There would be scholarships for nursing students, grants for medical research, crisis funds for frontline workers during emergencies, and mental health programs for healthcare professionals dealing with burnout and trauma. My money would outlive me, continuing to do good long after I was gone. 10 years after the day Mark fainted in my office, I was invited to speak at a national nursing conference in Chicago about the Morgan Foundation and the importance of supporting healthcare workers. I almost declined because public speaking had never been my strong suit, but Rebecca convinced me that my story needed to be heard. So there I was, standing backstage at the McCormick Place Convention Center, my hands trembling slightly as I listened to the moderator introduce me to an audience of 3,000 nurses, doctors, and healthcare administrators from across the country. "My name is Lisa Morgan," I began as I walked onto that massive stage, the bright lights making it hard to see the sea of faces in front of me. "And I want to tell you about the time I was called just a nurse by someone who thought that title meant I was less valuable than other people." I could feel the energy in the room shift immediately. Every nurse in that audience had heard some version of that dismissal, had felt that sting of being undervalued by people who didn't understand what we did every single day. I told them everything, not holding back any of the painful details. I told them about Mark's initial charm and how it slowly revealed itself to be a mask for deep insecurity and status obsession. I told them about the dinner where he'd openly wished I was a doctor instead of a nurse, about how he'd introduced me to his friends as his charity project, about the months of emotional manipulation where he'd tried to make me feel like I should be grateful he was willing to date someone with such an unimpressive career. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Then I told them about the secret I'd been keeping, about the investments I'd made over years of careful planning, about the $22 million sitting in my bank account that represented not just money, but freedom and security, and the ability to never be dependent on anyone who didn't value me. I watched eyes widen across the auditorium as people processed this information. A nurse with millions? It challenged every stereotype, every assumption about what our profession meant in terms of financial success. But here's what Mark didn't understand, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. That money didn't make me who I was. It was a tool, a resource, but it wasn't my identity. My identity was the work I did every day in that hospital. The patients I cared for, the lives I touched, the difference I made in moments of crisis and fear and pain. That was real. That mattered. And no amount of money could ever be as valuable as knowing that when someone needed help, I was there. I walked them through the harassment campaign, the legal battle, the moment when Mark's entire facade crumbled and revealed the desperate, broken man underneath. I talked about how Diana Torres had uncovered his pattern of targeting successful women, about how Rebecca Thompson had reached out to me, and we'd become allies in making sure Mark could never do this to anyone else. I described the trial, the conviction, the moment when justice was finally served, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple power of truth. And then I told them about the night in the emergency room, about looking down and seeing Mark on that gurney, broken and bleeding and terrified. I described the split-second decision I'd had to make, whether to walk away and let someone else handle it or to do what I'd been trained to do. In that moment, I said, my voice catching slightly, I understood what it really meant to be a nurse. It meant caring for people not because they deserve it, or because they've earned it, or because they'll appreciate it. It means caring for people because they're human beings who need help, period. That's the oath we take. That's the promise we make. The audience erupted in applause, but I held up my hand to quiet them because I wasn't finished yet. Mark tried to make me feel small by calling me just a nurse. But I want to tell every single person in this room something crucial. There is no just about what we do. We are the people who hold hands during final breaths. We are the ones who catch babies as they enter the world and comfort families as loved ones leave it. We are the advocates for patients who can't speak for themselves, the educators who help people understand their conditions, the warriors who fight for proper care even when the system tries to deny it. I paused, looking out at the thousands of faces, seeing my own struggles and triumphs reflected back at me in their expressions. We are the backbone of healthcare, and it's time we started acting like it. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing our worth. Because our worth isn't determined by salary or status or what other people think of our profession. Our worth is determined by the lives we save, the suffering we ease, and the humanity we bring to the hardest moments people will ever face. The standing ovation that followed was overwhelming. People were crying, hugging each other, holding up signs that said things like, "Proud to be just a nurse," with the word "just" crossed out. But what really moved me were the hundreds of nurses who came up to me afterward in the lobby, wanting to share their own stories. A middle-aged man told me about how his doctor girlfriend had left him because she was embarrassed to introduce him as a nurse at her medical school reunions. A young woman fresh out of nursing school talked about her father's disappointment that she hadn't become a physician. An older nurse with 30 years of experience described decades of being talked over by doctors who valued credentials over competence. One young nurse probably no more than 25 years old with bright pink highlights in her dark hair, grabbed my hands with tears streaming down her face. "My boyfriend keeps telling me I should quit and go into pharmaceutical sales because it would be more impressive and make more money," she said through sobs. "He says I'm wasting my potential being just a nurse." I was going to quit next month. I had already written my resignation letter. But listening to you tonight, I remembered why I became a nurse in the first place. Thank you for reminding me that what we do matters. I hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of her struggle because it had been my struggle too. "Don't let anyone steal your calling," I whispered to her. "Not for money, not for status, not even for love. Because at the end of your life, you won't regret staying true to who you are, but you will regret letting someone else convince you to be less than you were meant to be." She nodded against my shoulder, and when she pulled back, there was determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. That moment, right there, was worth more than anything Mark had ever offered me. That night, back in my hotel room overlooking the Chicago skyline, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those conversations, all those nurses who'd been made to feel like their choice of profession was somehow inadequate. I pulled out my laptop and started writing, not really sure what I was creating, but feeling compelled to capture these thoughts while they were fresh. What emerged over the next 3 hours was a manifesto of sorts, a declaration of the inherent value and dignity of nursing that I titled, "The Power of Just." I posted it on the Morgan Foundation website at 2 a.m, not expecting much response, just needing to get these words out into the world. By the time I woke up at 8, that post had been shared 17,000 times on social media. Nurses across the country were posting it with their own stories, their own experiences of being dismissed or undervalued. The hashtag #RockerJustANurse started trending, with people sharing photos of themselves in scrubs alongside stories of lives they'd saved and patients they'd helped. What had started as my personal story of revenge and redemption had somehow become a movement, a collective reclaiming of our professional identity and worth. The messages started flooding in. Nursing schools wanted to use my speech in their orientation programs. Hospital administrators reached out asking for advice on how to better support and value their nursing staff. Other nurses with hidden wealth or successful side businesses contacted me, saying they'd been afraid to talk about their financial success because of the stereotype that nurses were supposed to be struggling and selfless. One woman told me she'd been secretly running a multi-million-dollar real estate investment company for 15 years while working as a pediatric nurse, and she'd never told anyone because she thought people would judge her for having money while being a nurse. It was exactly 3 days after the Chicago conference when I received a message through the foundation's contact form that made me pause. The name attached to it was Mark Reynolds. I stared at that name on my screen for a full minute, debating whether to delete it unread or to open it and see what he possibly had to say after all these years. Curiosity won out, as it usually does, and I clicked it open. The message was longer than I expected, and as I read through it, I could hear Mark's voice in my head, but it was different now, humbler, more genuine than I'd ever heard from him before. "Lisa, I saw your speech online. Actually, that's not quite true. Someone I work with showed it to me because they know my story, or at least part of it. They know I went to prison for harassing and stalking a nurse, though they don't know that nurse was you. When I watched you speak, when I heard you tell our story to that audience, I felt so many things I don't even have names for. Shame, obviously. Regret. But also something like gratitude, which I know sounds crazy." He went on to explain that he'd been released from prison after 2 years for good behavior, that the mandatory therapy sessions had forced him to confront aspects of himself he'd been avoiding his entire adult life, and that when he got out, he'd discovered that his entire previous life had been completely destroyed. No business, no reputation, no friends who wanted anything to do with him. He'd moved to Phoenix, as far from New Jersey as he could get while still staying in the continental United States, and had struggled to find any kind of work with his criminal record and ruined professional reputation. I was living in a weekly rate motel and working night shifts at a gas station when I met a woman named Rosa, Mark's message continued. She was a home health aide who came in every night around 2 in the morning to buy coffee before starting her shift taking care of an elderly man with Alzheimer's. We started talking during her coffee breaks, and she told me about her work, about how hard it was physically and emotionally, about how little she got paid despite doing some of the most important and difficult work in healthcare. She was complaining one night about how society doesn't value caregivers, and I opened my mouth to agree with her, but then I stopped. Because I realized that I had been exactly that person who didn't value caregivers. I had dismissed nursing as unimportant, had treated you like you were less than because of your profession, and I had never truly understood what I was dismissing. Mark explained that Rosa had encouraged him to become a home health aide himself, that he'd gone through the training program and was now working as a caregiver for elderly patients in their homes. "It's the hardest work I've ever done," he wrote. "Physically exhausting, emotionally draining, and yes, severely underpaid. But it's also the first time in my adult life that I've felt like I was doing something that actually mattered. When Mr. Peterson, one of my patients, holds my hand and thanks me for helping him maintain his dignity while dealing with his declining health, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me all those years ago. Character matters more than status. Purpose matters more than prestige, and the work of caring for vulnerable people is some of the most valuable work anyone can do." He ended the message with an apology that felt more genuine than anything else he'd ever said to me. "I can never undo the damage I did to you. I can never give back the peace of mind I stole or erase the fear and stress I caused. All I can do is try to be a better person going forward and hope that somehow, in some small way, the work I'm doing now helps balance out some of the harm I caused. You were right about everything. I was the one who was just a shallow, status-obsessed fool. You were always so much more than I had the wisdom or character to see. I hope you're well, and I hope the foundation continues to grow and help people. Thank you for showing me, even though I fought against the lesson every step of the way, what really matters in life." I read that message 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or just another manipulation. But something about the tone, the self-awareness, the lack of any request for forgiveness or reconciliation, made me think that maybe, possibly, Mark had actually learned something real from his downfall. I didn't respond to the message because there was nothing left to say between us. Our story was finished, but I did forward it to Rebecca with a note asking what she thought. Rebecca called me within an hour, her voice full of skepticism but also a kind of cautious hope. "Either he's become a truly gifted manipulator or he's actually grown as a human being," she said. "The fact that he's working as a home health aide is either the world's longest con or genuine evidence of change. I want to believe people can change, Lisa. I really do. But I also don't think you owe him anything, not belief in his redemption, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement. You've moved on and built something beautiful out of the ashes he tried to leave you in. Whether he's genuinely changed or not is his journey, not yours." She was right, of course. I had moved on in the most complete way possible. Mark was a chapter in my life that had closed years ago, and whether he was now writing a redemption arc for himself or just finding new ways to be manipulative didn't really matter to my story anymore. What mattered was what I had built, the lives I was changing, and the legacy I was creating. The Morgan Foundation had become something far bigger than my personal revenge against a man who'd underestimated me. It had become a movement to support and elevate healthcare workers across the country. 6 months after the Chicago conference, we launched a new initiative called the Legacy Scholarship Program, specifically designed for nursing students from low-income backgrounds who were struggling to pay for their education. The scholarship covered not just tuition, but also living expenses, books, uniforms, and even childcare for students who were parents. We wanted to remove every possible barrier that might prevent someone from completing their nursing education and joining this incredible profession. The first year, we received over 3,000 applications for 50 available scholarships. Reading through those applications, seeing the struggles and determination of these aspiring nurses, reminded me why this work mattered so much. One application in particular stood out. It was from a 28-year-old single mother named Jennifer Santos, who was working 2 jobs while trying to get through nursing school and raise her 6-year-old daughter. Her essay about why she wanted to be a nurse was beautiful and heartbreaking. She wrote about watching her own mother, who had been a housekeeper, die of preventable complications from diabetes because she couldn't afford proper medical care and was afraid to go to the doctor. Jennifer wanted to be the kind of nurse who made sure people like her mother got the care they needed, regardless of their ability to pay or their immigration status or any other barrier that kept vulnerable people from accessing health care. We gave Jennifer one of the scholarships, and I personally called her to deliver the news. The sound of her sobbing with relief and joy on the other end of the phone made me cry too. "You don't understand what this means," she kept saying through tears. "I was going to have to drop out next semester. I couldn't afford to continue. You just saved my dream." But she was wrong about one thing. I did understand what it meant because I remembered being young and struggling and terrified that I wouldn't be able to finish my education. The difference was that I'd had to fight through it alone. Jennifer wouldn't have to. The foundation continued to grow in ways I never could have imagined. We established partnerships with hospitals across the country to create mental health support programs specifically for healthcare workers dealing with burnout, trauma, and compassion fatigue. We funded research into improving working conditions for nurses, studying everything from optimal patient-to-nurse ratios to the impact of mandatory overtime on patient outcomes. We created an emergency fund that nurses could access during personal crises, providing no-interest loans for everything from car repairs to medical bills to rent assistance. Every program was designed around one central principle: healthcare workers deserve to be supported with the same level of care and compassion they provide to others. 5 years after Mark's message, the foundation received an unusual request. A man named Carlos Mendez, who identified himself as a former patient of mine from years ago, wanted to make a substantial donation to the foundation in my honor. I didn't remember Carlos at first because I'd cared for thousands of patients over my career, but when he came to meet with me at the foundation offices, the memory came flooding back. Carlos had been a young man, barely 20 years old, who'd come into the emergency room after a suicide attempt. I'd been his nurse during those critical first hours, and I'd sat with him through the worst night of his life, holding his hand and telling him that his life had value even when he couldn't see it himself. "You saved my life that night," Carlos said, sitting across from me in my office with tears in his eyes. "Not just medically, though you did that too, but you treated me like a human being worth saving when I didn't think I was. You told me that depression was an illness, not a character flaw, and that getting help was a sign of strength, not weakness. You stayed 2 hours past the end of your shift just to make sure I wasn't alone, until the psychiatric team could see me. I don't know if you remember any of that, but I remember every word you said." Carlos had gone on to build a successful tech company, and he wanted to donate $5 million to the Morgan Foundation to establish a mental health support program specifically for healthcare workers struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Healthcare workers have some of the highest rates of suicide of any profession, Carlos explained, showing me statistics I was already painfully aware of. They spend their lives saving others. But who saves them when they're drowning? This donation is my way of paying forward what you did for me. You saved one life that night, and now I want to help you save thousands more. That donation allowed us to create the Carlos Mendez Center for Healthcare Worker Well-Being, a comprehensive mental health program that provided free therapy, support groups, crisis intervention, and preventive care for nurses, doctors, home health aides, and other medical professionals. We hired therapists who specialized in healthcare worker burnout and trauma. We created anonymous hotlines where people could call for support without fear of professional repercussions. And we partnered with hospitals to implement wellness programs that address the systemic issues contributing to mental health crises in our profession. The impact was immediate and profound. Within the first year, the Carlos Mendez Center provided services to over 2,000 healthcare workers. We received messages from nurses who said the therapy they received through the program had literally saved their lives, from doctors who'd been on the brink of leaving medicine entirely but found renewed purpose through our support groups, from home health aides who'd been suffering in silence for years and finally found a safe space to talk about the emotional toll of their work. Every success story reinforced what I'd always known. Taking care of the caregivers was just as important as taking care of patients. On the 10th anniversary of the Morgan Foundation, we held a massive celebration at a hotel ballroom in Newark, the city where this whole journey had begun. Over 500 people attended, including scholarship recipients, program beneficiaries, partner hospital administrators, foundation staff, and supporters who'd helped us grow from a small charity into a national movement. Rebecca stood next to me as we looked out at the crowded room, and she leaned over with that mischievous smile I'd come to know so well. "Remember when this all started because some idiot found your bank statement and fainted? Look what his stupidity created." I laughed, genuinely laughed, because she was right. None of this would exist if Mark hadn't discovered my secret, if his reaction hadn't forced me to confront my own relationship with money and purpose, if his cruelty hadn't pushed me to transform my private wealth into public good. In the strangest way, Mark's worst impulses had catalyzed the best thing I'd ever done. That didn't mean I was grateful to him or that I'd forgiven him or that I thought his actions were somehow justified. It just meant that I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and alchemized it into something beautiful. During the anniversary speeches, Jennifer Santos, the single mother we'd given a scholarship to 5 years earlier, took the stage. She was now a registered nurse working in the same hospital where I'd spent most of my career, specializing in patient advocacy and working with underserved communities. "Lisa Morgan told me when I received the scholarship that I was saving a dream," Jennifer said, her voice strong and clear. But what she didn't tell me was that by saving my dream, she was also saving all the future patients I would care for, all the families I would support, all the lives I would touch. That's the power of investing in healthcare workers. You're not just helping one person, you're helping everyone that person will ever help. The ripple effects are infinite. She introduced 3 of her former patients who'd volunteered to speak about the care she'd provided, including an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who Jennifer had helped navigate the complex healthcare system while dealing with cancer treatment. "Jennifer saved my life," Mrs. Chen said simply, not just because she was skilled, though she was, but because she treated me with dignity and compassion when I felt like I was losing both. And she could do that because someone believed in her enough to make sure she could complete her education, that someone was Lisa Morgan in this foundation. As I listened to these testimonials, I felt something shift in my understanding of what I'd built. The Morgan Foundation wasn't just about supporting healthcare workers, though that was certainly our mission. It was about recognizing that caring for people is the most fundamental human act, and that the people who dedicate their lives to that caring deserve to be cared for in return. It was about creating a world where someone's choice to be a nurse or a home health aide or any other kind of caregiver was celebrated, not dismissed. It was about proving that character, compassion, and purpose were more valuable than status, money, or prestige. Near the end of the evening, as people were mingling and sharing stories, a young man approached me hesitantly. He was probably in his late 20s, dressed in the crisp uniform of a home health aide, and he looked nervous about interrupting me. "Ms. Morgan? I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to introduce myself. My name is David Reynolds. I'm Mark Reynolds' nephew." My heart skipped a beat at that name, but I kept my expression neutral and invited him to continue. My uncle called me last week when he heard about tonight's event, David said, speaking quickly as if he was afraid I'd walk away before he could finish. He asked me to come and to tell you something if I got the chance. He said to tell you that he's been sober for 3 years, that he's still working as a home health aide in Phoenix, and that he volunteers twice a week at a support group for men working through anger and entitlement issues. He said he knows he has no right to ask for your acknowledgement or forgiveness, but he wanted you to know that the work you do through this foundation has inspired him to keep trying to be better every day. I studied David's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but all I saw was genuine earnestness and maybe a touch of embarrassment about his uncle's past behavior. Why did he send you instead of coming himself or even sending another message? I asked. David shifted uncomfortably. He said that you'd moved on from that chapter of your life and that inserting himself back into your story, even to apologize or update you, would be making it about him again. He said the best thing he could do for you was to stay out of your way while trying to honor the lessons you taught him, but he wanted you to know, somehow, that those lessons stuck. I thanked David for delivering the message and asked him about his own work as a home health aide. It turned out he'd been inspired to enter the profession after seeing his uncle's transformation, after hearing Mark talk about how meaningful the work was despite its challenges. We talked for 20 minutes about the difficulties of home health care, the lack of proper support and compensation for aides, and his own dreams of maybe going back to school to become a nurse someday. Before he left, I made sure he had information about the Foundation's scholarship programs. If David Reynolds wanted to become a nurse, I'd be happy to support that dream, regardless of his last name or his uncle's history. That night, driving home from the anniversary celebration, I thought about all the ways this story could have ended. I could have stayed bitter and angry, could have let Mark's cruelty define me and close me off from the world. I could have hoarded my wealth out of fear and mistrust, never risking the vulnerability of letting people know who I really was. I could have quit nursing, convinced by Mark's dismissive words that it wasn't a valuable profession. Instead, I'd chosen a different path. I'd chosen to transform pain into purpose, secrecy into service, and personal vindication into collective empowerment. The epilogue to this story isn't about Mark's redemption or his punishment. It's not about the money or the foundation or even the thousands of lives we've touched, though all of those things matter. The real epilogue is about the young nurse who came up to me at the end of the anniversary party, a first-year nursing student who'd received one of our scholarships. She grabbed my hand and said, with tears in her eyes, "My boyfriend told me last week that I was wasting my time being just a nurse. I broke up with him yesterday. Thank you for showing me that I deserve someone who sees my worth." That's the legacy I was building. Not one of revenge or wealth or even professional success, but one of helping people recognize their own value and refuse to let anyone diminish it. Every healthcare worker who stood up for themselves, every nursing student who chose purpose over prestige, every caregiver who demanded respect for their work was writing another chapter in a story that had started with one man's contempt and one woman's quiet determination not to be defined by it. My name is Lisa Morgan. I'm still a nurse, working 3 days a week at the same hospital where I've spent most of my career. I still love the work, still find meaning in the small moments of connection with patients, still believe that caring for vulnerable people is some of the most important work anyone can do. My bank account has grown to $31 million through careful investments, but I live simply in the same modest apartment because home was never about square footage or luxury amenities. The vast majority of my wealth is earmarked for the Morgan Foundation, continuing the work of supporting healthcare workers long after I'm gone. That's my real legacy, not the money itself, but what it's being used to create. And if you'd told me 10 years ago, when Mark Reynolds fainted in my office after discovering my secret, that his betrayal would ultimately lead to all of this, I wouldn't have believed you. But life has a way of taking our worst moments, and if we're willing to do the work, transforming them into something beautiful. So yes, someone once called me just a nurse, and thought that made me less valuable than other people. But he was wrong. I was never just anything. I was and am exactly who I chose to be: a nurse, a foundation founder, a mentor, an advocate, and a woman who learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives touched, dreams supported, and dignity defended. That's a fortune no one can ever take away, and that's justice,